Howdy. Have you ever tried to find some evidence for something you were writing, and as you were reading it, you were just like, what are the words in this quote, and does it even make sense for what I'm writing? Well, let me help you answer those two questions in today's informational writing skills video on direct quotes and paraphrases. This is our proficiency rubric we are working with for today. As always, by the end of this video, you should be either proficient or highly proficient in the skills. Feel free to pause this and read through what you should be knowing by the end of the video. Our agenda for today is the importance of evidence, direct quotes, paraphrased evidence, and evidence relevance. And as always, I'm trying to keep this video as short as I can, so I won't explain some things in detail. If you want more information on a concept, look up the video after this video. Here's your evidence types. The reason that evidence is important, firstly, hopefully you know this, evidence supports your main ideas and arguments because you want to make sure that people know it's not just you saying this, but other credible sources like research, experts, and studies are also backing up what you're saying. Evidence helps make your writing more convincing and authoritative. Again, you want to show your writer that other people are also saying the same thing, that are trustworthy. So there are two different ways to share evidence in your writing, and that is through direct quotes or paraphrased evidence, or AKA in those exact words or in other words. So let's talk about those exact words with direct quotes, which are the exact words. This is evidence that is copied word for word from an original source. It is best to use direct quotes whenever the original wording is very powerful or unique. If there isn't a better way or a clearer way to say what's happening in that quote, if the quote already matches the tone of your writing, and if the quote is already short, or you can make it very short. There's some punctuation you need to know about that will work in direct quotes. Most of the time, you'll just use quotation marks. Those are just those little beep beeps that go around the actual quote. Most people use just those. Sometimes you might need to use ellipses. Those are the 3 dots when you need to skip certain unnecessary phrases. And every once in a while, you might also have to use brackets when you need to change the direct quote slightly to correct or add some information to it. So these are the punctuations I'm talking about. So on the left, you've got your quotation marks, the middle is the ellipses, and on the right are the brackets. So let's look at how those are going to be in the sentence. If you're just doing a regular old quote with quotation marks, this is your example. So there's your direct quote. The drama club met after school in the auditorium, and the group discussed their plans for the spring play. You've got your quotation marks around it. Pretty simple, right? Now, let's say you want to skip some of that, so you want to use ellipses. So now the quote says, the drama club met after school, ... and discussed their plans for the spring play. So notice that these ... dots replace, it looks like 5 or 6 words in the quote. But notice the quote still says the same thing. So we just decided to take out some unnecessary extra information and replace it with ellipses to make it easier for the reader. And now let's say you want to clarify something in the quote, so you want to use brackets. So now the quote says, the drama club met after school in the auditorium, comma, and the group, in brackets, the actors, discussed their plans for the spring play. Maybe your reader didn't know who the group was, so you wanted to clarify that the group that discussed the plans were the actors. So just make sure you remember that in direct quotes, you want to say exactly what she said. Direct quotes, okay? Now let's talk about paraphrase evidence, something you might be a little less knowledgeable about. And that idea is that you're putting the original quote in your own language or your own words. You want to make sure that your paraphrase maintains the original meaning of the quote, but you just want to use different words to say it. Paraphrasing is a really good idea for a number of reasons. If the original quote is too complex or confusing and you want to make it easier for the reader, you might paraphrase it. If the quote is way too long and there's a shorter way to say it in your own words, then you might paraphrase. If the exact wording of the information isn't important, so it's okay for you to say it in your own words, that's fine. If you also want to integrate the information more smoothly in your writing, maybe the quote is a little awkward, so you'd rather just make it a little bit more seamless in your writing. Paraphrasing is good. And then maybe you've already used a direct quote and you want to mix it up a little bit. That's kind of an advanced tip that maybe you mix up not using just direct quotes, but you have some direct quotes and some paraphrases in a paper. That's usually something that's encouraged. Just know that if you paraphrase your evidence, you still need to cite the original source, and that is because it's still someone else's idea or research, even if it's in your own words, so you want to give credit to that. So let's look at an example of a direct quote versus a paraphrase. So here's our direct quote, and I'm not even going to read all that, so you can pause and read all of that yourself, but just notice you can probably see it's 5 lines long. There's a lot of big words. It looks kind of confusing. So maybe you've decided I'd rather paraphrase all that. So instead of all that, you said, Dr. Alvarez explained that scientists are worried climate change will melt ice caps, raise sea levels, and force people to leave coastal areas. So this is the exact same information as a direct quote, but you can see it is much shorter and has much better, shorter words. So it's a lot clearer what's being said. So this is a great example of when a paraphrase would actually be much better than the direct quote. So just remember that paraphrases are kind of like basically the same information. It's something similar to the direct quote, but you're just making a long story short. And your reader's going to thank you for that. Now, just because you know how to put evidence in a paper doesn't mean you should. You want to know if it's relevant. So, relevant evidence is evidence that should 100% directly support your point or claim. It should be on topic, accurate, and connected to your reasoning. So, it's important to make sure your evidence is relevant to your topic because you want to keep your writing focused and persuasive, so it's better for your reader. It keeps you from distracting or confusing your audience with stuff that they don't really need to know. And it helps your reader trust your ideas because you're choosing evidence that actually backs up what you're saying. So when you're trying to figure out if your evidence is relevant, firstly, of course, identify your claim or main idea. After that, you want to look through all parts of your evidence and see if it directly proves or explains your point. And then if it does, make sure that the source is credible. After that, if there's anything in that quote that you need to remove and maybe replace with ellipses because it's not related, that's a good idea. And then, of course, you want to explain how your evidence is connected to your main idea so the reader knows how it's relevant. So let's look at an example. Firstly, we do want to remind you about evidence credibility. Feel free to pause and look. These are the 8 things that you want to see in a source. You might not check off all 8 yeses, but the more yeses you check off, the better, more credible that evidence is going to be. Again, feel free to pause and read through this. So let's look at an example of evidence that is very relevant, somewhat relevant, and not really relevant. So let's say that your claim is that school uniforms help create a more focused learning environment. Now, I'm going to give you 3 pieces of evidence and explain why they are or aren't relevant. So, evidence 1, which is going to be highly relevant to this claim, says a recent study found that schools with uniforms saw a 30% decrease in classroom distractions compared to schools without uniforms. So the reason this is highly relevant to your claim is that it directly connects uniforms to fewer distractions. So notice in your claim, you said school uniforms help create a more focused learning environment. So this quote both talks about school uniforms and how they help with classroom distractions. So that's both of the things that you talk about in your claim. So this source is very relevant and a good one to use for your writing. Now let's say you look at option 2. This one's going to be somewhat relevant. So this one says many schools with uniforms also have stricter cell phone policies. So the reason this is partly relevant is because this quote does mention uniforms and it does talk a little bit about the learning environment, but it really kind of talks about cell phones, which is not what you mentioned in your claim. So again, even though it talks about uniforms, it doesn't talk about the focus in the learning environment. So it's not really all that relevant to your writing, so you don't really want to use this one. And then option 3, this one's going to be not relevant at all. This example says school uniforms are available in a variety of colors and patterns. And you can see this one's not relevant because it talks about uniform design. It doesn't mention anything about how it affects the classroom. So even though it says uniforms in the sentence, it actually has nothing to do with your claim on uniforms. So don't use this one. Not useful at all. So just make sure that anytime you use evidence in your writing, make sure it fits perfectly with what you're talking about, and don't use anything that has nothing to do with anything. Stay away from that evidence. Now, let's look at an example of quotes and paraphrases. So we've got this example that says school uniform can help students stay focused in class. A recent district report noted after uniforms were introduced in all middle schools, teachers in surveyed classrooms reported a noticeable drop in off task behavior. This shows that uniforms can reduce distractions, allowing students to concentrate more on their work instead of what they or their classmates are wearing. So, this is our point or claim. So, it's similar to the one we had in the last slide about school uniforms helping focus. Here's our direct quote. You'll notice we've got our quotation marks around it to show that this is a word for word copy of evidence. We've got our ellipses to show that we skipped some information in the quote that we didn't really need. And we do have bracketed information because we wanted to clarify that these teachers came from specific classrooms. And then again, you want to explain the relevance of the evidence. So we do have this explanation about how this evidence supports your claim. And then, of course, if you didn't like this direct quote and wanted to change it up a little bit, you could have just said, a recent district report revealed that middle school teachers noticed a clear improvement in student behavior when the uniform policy began. So this is, again, similar information to the direct quote, maybe a little bit shorter, and you might feel that this one fits into your writing better. Completely up to you on this one. All right, friends. So that is using quotes and paraphrases, making sure it's relevant. So hopefully in the future, anytime you've got some evidence on your hands, you're going to make sure that it is relevant and that you're choosing the best option, either a direct quote or a paraphrase, for the best evidence ever in your writing. So good luck using evidence in your writing, using quotes and paraphrases, and I will see you in the next video.